I love painting yellow. I think it's actually one of my favorite colors to paint. But for some reason, the last Imperial Fist I remember painting was at least 4 or 5 years ago, and that was for someone else. So I figured I had access to this really cool Horus Heresy Imperial Fist Terminator Praetor. So, as the iconography that's already on the model goes, let's paint him as an Imperial Fist and do some bright yellow. I started out this model by actually base coating him red, which then almost made me want to paint some Blood Angels because, I don't know, red Marines look cool, and I also haven't painted any of them in a long time. But I just airbrushed this with Games Workshop's Evil Sunz Scarlet, just as a couple of thin coats until I built up an opaque layer. And then I went in with some Liquitex Titanium White ink because it goes through an airbrush nice and smooth, don't really have to thin it. You know, there's no speckling or grossness, and I added some pre-shade. I kind of targeted the model from, you know, from certain angles. It's not particularly realistic, but I mean, it's a miniature, who cares? I just wanted to create some stark gradients between the red and the white. As an underpinning layer for my yellow that will go over the top of it. I strategically used the shape of the model to my advantage and just, you know, targeted certain areas on the legs, on the arms. There's a lot of sharp angles on this guy. Angles where, you know, there's layers of armor plates sitting on top of one another, so you can kind of get a shadow underneath there, and just built up what I thought looked cool as, you know, underpinned shadows. This didn't actually matter as much as I initially thought it might, because the yellow ink that I used, which is Scale 75's Inktense Yellow, is actually incredibly strong and incredibly opaque. I haven't really used their inks all too much, but even a yellow, which is, you know, traditionally a very difficult color to work with and a color that, you know, is hard to get good coverage, you can see now it really just didn't, the pre-shading really just didn't show through. So I went back with Games Workshop's Iyanden Yellow contrast paint through an airbrush and just kind of re-sketched in some shadows. I would have done this anyway, because I just wanted to reinforce some of that orange into the shadow. I know it's called Iyanden Yellow, but it's really an orange. And this is a nice effect that I like to do with most projects now, is just adding in some shadow with an airbrush and some ink. It's a really powerful effect, and it takes virtually no time, and I'll be honest, virtually no skill. So it is a crutch that I like to lean on a little bit. Now, before I go too much further into this video, I need to thank my patrons. It's you guys that really help me out in actually creating these videos and make it possible for me to do so. I want to specifically shout out Troy, Drew, and The Rascal. Thank you guys a ton. If you want to support me over on Patreon, you'll get access to, obviously, in-video shoutouts, the ability to submit pictures of your models to be featured at the end of videos, polls on what I should do for future videos, private email for tuition, and as well as access to the video project relocation program, where sometimes when I paint models, I actually give them away to my patrons, just like the Cerastus Knight that I'm giving away in the next week. So if any of that sounds interesting to you and you want to come over and help support, I would greatly appreciate it. But without rambling on for too much longer, let's get back into the paint job. Now, off camera, I actually gloss varnished the model in preparation for an oil wash. So I'm using Abteilung 502's ochre oil and their fast dry thinner, mixing them together in a cup. I don't know an exact recipe because I kind of just wing it. As you can see, I use a pipette, just drop some in and mix it up until it kind of looks good to me. I think I actually mixed it up a little bit too thick, so I did thin it down a bit more off camera. But you can see once the model is nice and glossy, the low surface tension oils just run straight off the paintbrush and straight into all of the nice recesses, crevices, and low points in the miniature. This is the only way I would ever pin wash any model ever again after doing it for the first time. So if you haven't given oils a try, I would greatly recommend it, because one, it's super satisfying, it's super easy, and it speeds up your paint jobs a ton. I then hit the model with some AK Interactive Ultra Matte Varnish, and you can see this is how it looks. Off camera, I blacked out all of the, parts that weren't armor panels or weren't going to be, gone over with another color, another dark color like Rhinox hide, because there's no point filming that. I then gave all of the armor an edge highlight with white paint mixed in with just a tiny little bit of that Inktense yellow ink. And then it was time to start highlighting the grey parts. I used Vallejo's Wolf Grey and Somber Grey and did a couple of increasingly brighter highlights on the ribbed parts of the armor, and then used the same paints and highlighted the kind of black fist motifs around the model. I then painted the shields on his shins with Steel Grey and then Wolf Grey, and then gave them a wash with Games Workshop's Apothecary White contrast paint. To do the little skull, I mixed Vallejo's Stonewall Grey with black, base coated it, and then kind of stipple highlighted it all the way up to Stonewall. Once I got to Stonewall, I just added some white to that and continued to stipple highlight while covering less and less surface area. To paint the scrolls, I just used Games Workshop's Rhinox hide and then added a little bit of Vallejo Game Color off-white and covered smaller and smaller portions of the scrolls as I got brighter. To base coat the tabards, I used Scale 75's African Shadow. Then over the top of that, I used Games Workshop's Mephiston Red and painted the entire thing. Gave it a wash with Games Workshop's Carroburg Crimson, and then a highlight with Games Workshop's Evil Sun Scarlet. I painted the wreaths by using Vallejo's dark green and then adding more and more Escopina green while also covering less of the surface area. It's now time to do my least favorite part of this model, all of the trim, which I decided to do in non-metallic metal. Now, I'm not the best at non-metallic metal, but I do it every now and again. I didn't put a huge amount of effort into blending this and making it smooth. I kind of wanted it to have a little bit of a rougher look. But I used Rhinox hide just to base coat it, and then added some golden brown from Vallejo and just stippled on and covered less and less surface area as I got brighter over many layers. Once I got to that golden brown without any Rhinox hide in it, I started to add off-white, also covering less surface area while desaturating it, making it brighter and kind of giving it that real reflective look. Once I'd gotten to almost straight off-white, I added a couple of, tiny dots of straight white paint here and there, just to cap off that real reflective look. To paint these, big shield emblems on the model and the Aquila on the shoulder, I wanted a bit of a different look. So I used Vallejo Game Colors Aquamarine mixed in with a tiny bit of Games Workshop Stegodon Scale Green, just to darken and desaturate it a little bit. Base coated the whole thing and then used a sponge while adding more and more white and kind of sponged that on and gave it a little bit of a faux marble look. I did overstep a little bit in a couple of spots, but that's all right because it's easy enough to just cover up with, some hand painted chipping. I went with an idea of doing cloaks that I've had for a little while, but I've never really tried out. I used a makeup brush for some very soft dry brush highlights and used the same greys as we had before, Vallejo's Steel Grey and Wolf Grey, and did a couple of passes with them. And then I just wanted to tint over the top of that. So I wanted to have lots of texture, but you know, in a colored cloak. So I went over the top of this with Games Workshop's Doomfire Magenta Contrast paint, but it was way too opaque for what I wanted to do. So I ended up going over the whole thing with another dry brush of straight white to try and salvage this, give it more texture back. And then I went over the top of that with Vallejo's Fluoro Red, which is, you know, brighter again. I figured it would give the cloak a lot of pop, a lot of vibrancy, while also being a lot more translucent, so it would show some of that texture underneath. I then gave that a gloss varnish and another oil wash, and you can really see how the capillary action and lack of surface tension just pulls that oil right into the deepest crevices. Then, using the same grays as everything else, I painted the little emblems on the cloak. I then painted the base, which if you watch the previous video, you'll see exactly how I did in far more detail. And now it was time to do the power sword. So using that same white ink, I masked off the model and strategically sprayed the sword so I could, you know, use the shape of it to shield one half from the other, and added some white highlights, and then went over the top of that with some fluoro blue from Vallejo. I'm really obsessed with using fluoro paints at the moment. They're just super vibrant and really easy to get a nice effect from. Maybe I'll get sick of it eventually, but I don't know at this point. I went over the top of that with white just to re-establish more bright highlights, and then I went with 1 drop of blue fluoro paint to 4 drops of Games Workshop's Athematic Blue contrast paint, and just targeted, you know, halfway between the blue and the white, just to add a little bit of a, you know, bluey green teal transition and some more color interest into the sword, as opposed to just being, you know, straight blue and white, which I think is pretty boring. I then just gave the sword a quick edge highlight with straight white and was happy to call this done. This was the first time, as I mentioned before, that I've painted an Imperial fist in a long time, but you know, for how little time I kind of spent on this guy, I'm really happy with how he turned out. So maybe this is the push that I needed to go with, you know, an Imperial fist force for Heresy, because I do want to actually start a Heresy army, and I've been umming and ahhing on what to do. Empress Children was of course the first choice, but I'm doing, you know, a magenta regular Space Marine army, so I don't see the point of doing 2 armies in that color. But anyway, I hope you guys got something out of this video. Again, if you want to support me in making these, go check out the Patreon, the link's in the description. If you can't, that's absolutely fine. Make sure to like the video, maybe leave a comment with what you'd want to see from me in the future, and I will see you guys in the next one.